Welcome to the last module of using Vue with ASP.NET Core by example. In this module, we'll be talking about how to secure Vue with JSON Web Tokens. We'll start by introducing what JSON Web Tokens are. I'll show you how they work. We'll create a routing guard to allow us to use JSON tokens. I'll show you how to store authentication data in Vuex. We'll implement a login within Vue. We'll retrieve the JWT from the server. We'll deal with redirection inside Vue. We'll use the JSON Web Token to make a server call. Let's get started. So let's start with what are JSON Web Tokens. JSON Web Tokens are simply an open standard for defining tokens. The token contains information, claims, and expiration about the user that's trying to use them. These tokens are server-signed, so a server that generates them can usually validate them as well. And that some claims and some information inside the JSON Web Token does not require decryption to get at. And that way the server can send information about the logged in user to some client. And in our case, that's going to be a Vue application. But what does a JWT actually look like? It starts with a header. And you'll see that the format here looks like JSON because, unsurprisingly, I suspect, it is made up of JSON. The header specifies the type of token and the algorithm for encrypting it and decrypting it. And the payload is actually information about the user, and this is information that's being transmitted from one place to another. There is a schema in JWT for some standard information about the user: the issuer, the subject, the audience, the expiration, a unique ID for this token. Those are all specified in the JSON Web Token standard. You can extend this by adding your own information into the payload as necessary as well. One thing that ASP.NET does is actually add a unique name here, and that represents the user ID on the server. And finally, there's the signature. The signature takes an arbitrary key and encrypts the base64 of the header plus the base64 of the payload with a period between them so that this can be validated. Now, the key would be a private key that only the server, in our case, is going to know about. When you put this all together, it simply takes the base64 of the header plus a period, a base64 of the payload plus a period, and then the base64 of the actual signature. And so because of this, the header and the payload aren't actually encrypted. They're just generating that signature. And so what you end up with is a base64 encoded string that represents that token that includes all that information. Let's see what this looks like with our ASP.NET Core project. So now let's see how JWTs work. In Visual Studio, I have our project that we've been working through. And if we look at one of the controllers, the account controller specifically, you'll see near the bottom of the account controller, this call to create token. This takes a credential model, which essentially just includes a username and a password, and it generates claims based on that information. So the subject is going to be the user's email, a GTI for that unique identifier is just going to be a GUID. And then I'm specifying a unique name with the username in case we need to show it inside of Vue. Remember, these claims are not secrets. They're ones that anyone who gets a hold of the token can actually look at. And then we generate this token. There's a little helper inside of ASP.NET that'll let us do that. And I'm not going to walk through how to do the server side nearly as much as I am how to do this client side. But essentially, we end up with a result that has this string token that we can pass back to the server to get validated. And then we're passing back the expiration so that we know it without having to tear apart the token on the client side. So let's run this project for a minute. Let's talk about how this actually works. So we've seen how we've built all of this, but if we go ahead and look at something like API customer, we'll see this is an API call that doesn't require any sort of authentication. It just allows us to get into it completely. And we don't actually want that. Inside of ASP.NET Core, you can set up cookie-based authentication or a number of other options. And one of those options is JWT tokens. The benefit here is whenever inside of your Vue application you need to do something, you don't want to necessarily force them to go to a separate page and log in with cookies and then come back and hope that you have all that state set up again. We'd like to be able to do it all within Vue. Now, this isn't the best way to handle it in every single case, but I want you to have the option because often it is a good solution. So back here in Visual Studio, we'll notice that that customer that we were able to get without any problem didn't have any protection. It did not require authentication to actually work. And the reason for that is that nowhere in here are we using that call that says require authentication. Let's look at startup for a moment. I'm going to make some assumptions that you've looked at this before, that you're not brand new to ASP.NET. But here I have a setup inside startup.cs that says add authentication, and I'm adding the two kinds of authentication, cookie-based and JWT bearer-based. And we'll see what that looks like in just a moment. But this means that we have two kinds of authentication that we're going to support, and that by default, cookie is going to be the one we're going to use most prevalently. So we come over here to the customer controller. Let's go ahead and add a new attribute up here called authorize. And if we just left authorize like that, it would require us to be logged in through the cookie system, through a regular login page for this to work. We actually want to say, in this case, because it's an API controller, it's a controller for the API, that we want to support the authentication scheme for JWT bearer defaults.authentication scheme. This is a class that contains the magic string here that is actually bearer. So this is going to say, when you come in here, we're going to expect that there's going to be a token assigned to this controller. And here in Postman, which is something I'm using to craft up these calls, Postman is a free tool you can download and allows you to specify headers, footers, and bodies, etc. of all sorts of calls so we can see transparently what these calls are going to look like. So if we look at HTTP localhost 8000 API customer, just like we had done in the browser a minute ago, let's do customer, we'll see that we're getting back an unauthorized. That's because it doesn't know who we are. We just told it that we're not going to allow it to make the call because we are an unauthorized user. Right now, it assumes we're an anonymous user, and that anonymous user doesn't have access to this. So what we need to do actually is go and get a token. By calling API account create token, that allows anonymous authentication, but requires us to have a body. This body has the data type of application.json, just like any of our API calls are going to. And this is going to allow us to specify a username and a password. And these would be credentials that we would normally get from the user. And during our process of making Vue do it, we're going to do just that. By including this in this create token, I've done everything correctly, we'll get this body back with this actual token and then an expiration. In order to use it, we're going to need to copy the whole token. And we make a call like creating a new customer. This is a new API call that says go ahead and create a customer for the currently logged in user. We're going to specify that the authorization is bearer token. And let me replace this with our token. And all that this authorization tab does is actually set up this header. So the header here is authorization, the word bearer as the beginning, and then the actual token after it. That's what a bearer authentication looks like, and that's what we're going to do with JWT. And so if we make this call, we can see that it created this new user for us. And the interesting part about this is how this authorization header, by including it, simply allowed us to do this. In fact, it did something that we didn't send it. So when we sent the body, we gave it our name, company, phone number, but the actual request, it's including a username. And that's because it's taken that information about the username that we found in the token when we created the token and included it so that it knew that this customer belonged to us as a user. Let's see how this works in Vue next. So now let's create a view that we want to secure. Back in the store, I'm going to open up that www root directory, and I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call customerinfo.vue. I'm going to use the single file component support in Vue to make that happen. And so I want a template. In our case, we just want some script. And all we're going to do with the script is just export default. And for now, we'll just start with an empty object. We'll probably add some more pieces to it. And for the template, I'm just going to paste in a very simple template that just creates a div. I'm using some bootstrap things to set the data. I'm creating a router link to go back to the root so that we can, let me actually put this in 2 lines so it's a little easier for you to see. So that we can return to the main page when we want. And then it's just showing the error and showing 3 lines, the company, name, and phone number. And we're just going to get this data from the existing customer module inside of the store. This should look familiar up to this point. We've done a lot of different examples just like this. And the only thing we really need to do in code is set up data as a function that returns an error, which will start out as an empty string because we're binding to an error here in case we need to. And now that we've got this, we need to include this in the routing. So in our example, we have the routing directly here in the app, and I'm going to do a little refactoring to separate the router from the app.js because that's a pretty common case. So I'm just going to create a router.js, and most of what I want in here is stuff that's still already in app.js. So I'm going to bring in Vue and all of the components because we're using those all actually in the routing, not in the creation of the app. So we'll start with those. And then if I go back and come down here, I want to add the Vue use router. I want to keep that here in the router just to make it a little cleaner. And of course, we want this whole section of routes to be over here in the router. And instead of creating the router here, we're just going to say router and then import router from router. So we can essentially get rid of all of these, except for these little pieces that we see we're creating here. So it makes the app.js pretty simple. But then here in the router at the end, we're going to need to move this up a little, create the router, and then we'll export default the router. So we're just going to export this whole router. And I've separated these into 2 lines on purpose. And we'll get to that in the next video. But first, let's go ahead and add our new component. Remember, we created a customer info, and we're just going to get it, no surprise, from customer info. And so to create a new route here, we're just going to create a new object inside of our route list. We're going to set its path. And in my case, it's just going to be customer info. No parameters, nothing fancy there. And then the component is simply customer info. Don't need any of the other pieces. That should just work. In fact, if we go back over to the main page, we'll see our store. And if we just append here customer info, and as we try to go to customer info, it's not working. If we go back to the task runner, we'll see the error is showing that there's an equal here in the default. Whoops, I always forget whether I should put that. Let's close that, take a look again. It looks like it has built it, and therefore, if we refresh, we can now see this new customer info. Of course, we're not getting the info or pulling any of the data back yet, but we'll get there. We can go back and forth between the views. So we have the actual view working, but we don't have it secured in any way. Let's do that next. So now that we've created the new view, let's talk about creating a routing guard. Back in Visual Studio, take a look at the router. And one of the things we'd like to do here, we'd like to be able to check before a route is sent that the user is allowed to go there. And we can do that with a little call called before each, and then we can pass it in a callback function. This is going to get called on each routing request before the request is successful, so we can have a chance to actually change the outcome. This takes 3 parameters: the route it's going to, the route it's coming from, and I'm using the underscore there because it can be a reserved word, and then we have next. And in the perfect case, all we would need to do is call next. That is a method that says just do whatever the next thing is. That next thing may be another call in the chain before the route happens, or it might be just making the route happen. It's a way to step from one thing to the other. You're not going to necessarily return. You're just going to say, do the next thing. But in our case, what we'd like to do is see if security is required and do something about it. Otherwise, we'll just call next. So if security isn't required, we're going to want to check that. And the way we can redirect this in essence is call next and then give it an object that represents where we want it to go. So let's go to a route that doesn't exist yet called /login. So if security is required, we'd like to be able to go to some page called login so that the user can actually log in. But of course, this is gobbledygook. This isn't real code here. What we'd like to do is check the path it's going to see if security is required. And the way we do that is we can check an object called meta, and that meta is just a property bag full of properties that we can put on it. And I'm just going to say if auth required. If that both exists and is true, then let's force them to go to the login page. So how do we get this auth required? We go up to the actual route. We can add an object called meta and then just add auth required or whatever you end up wanting to call it as a property. So by adding the property here, we're giving ourselves the ability to actually check it down here. Now, if all authentication is required in every case, you don't always want to go to login. What we really want to do is say if user is logged in, right? We want to check that first. And if the user is not logged in, we'd like to be able to then go to the login page, right? Otherwise, we'd like it to fall through. So this else doesn't make as much sense. Let's just leave the next down here so that in all other cases it works. And just after the next call, we'll say return to prevent the empty next call from ever happening. But how do we test this user is logged in? In the next video, we're going to be actually adding this data into the Vuex store. So let's go ahead and say if store.getters.is authenticated, and this of course doesn't work yet. Instead of not, let's make sure that we're checking to see that it's false. So if authenticated is false, we'll go ahead and fall in and force them to go to the logon page. So all that feels sort of right what we want. Again, this doesn't exist yet, but the store, where are we getting the store? We actually have to import the store here. Remember, the store is a singleton, so even if it's not being attached to something like the routes, if we bring in the store, we can still use it because we're getting the same version of that object that every piece has. To test to see how this works, let's go ahead and open up the cart. Let's just add a line up here for a router link that will just ask for my info. And I'll make it a little button up here that just says button, button info, and button small to make sure it's used right. And then we're going to specify the two to be that customer info link that we talked about earlier. So if we refresh the page, hopefully I've done everything right. And if I go to the My Info, it'll take us to that customer info page. Now this is working right now because inside of the router, we're checking to see whether the getters is authenticated. And this is actually failing because we haven't implemented it yet. So let's move on to the next video and implement our data for authentication inside our data store. So now let's store our authentication data in Vuex. Let's come back to Visual Studio and we're going to create a new file called auth.js. And this is just going to export default and object. And this is going to be one of the modules inside of Vuex. In fact, if we open up the data store, let's go ahead and import that as auth from auth. And then down here in our store, we'll just add auth here. So it'll be a third module inside our store. So just like we've done before, we're going to want state, getters, actions, and mutations. And that'll be just the default for our authentication or our auth state. And what are we going to want to store here? So in our state, we're going to start with just two pieces of data. The JWT itself, which will start with an empty string, and then an expiration here, just so we can more easily check to see whether the token itself has expired. And I'm just going to say new date so that almost immediately we've reached the expiration. And then here in getters, we're going to want to implement that is authenticated. And we're going to do that by simply returning that we have a valid JWT and that our expiration is less than now, right? If it's equal or greater to now, then it shouldn't be expired. So we actually want the expiration to be greater than new date. I always get that backwards. Now, these aren't properties that we're going to be able to use immediately. So the getters themselves are going to pass us in a state object, and then we can just check for state.jwt, state.expiration. And in this way, we'll actually be able to get the authenticated piece. We're also going to need to get the actual token. The fact that the token's a JWT is going to be a side effect. So we'll say token state. In this case, I'll just use a lambda and just return state.jwt. So we've got a couple of getters, and we could be using the state information, but these are a little easier for us to actually deal with. So if we've done this right, over here in the browser, when I refresh, and I click on My Info, it should actually take us to a login. Now, we haven't implemented the view yet, but we can see it's caught that we're not authenticated because the JWT is blank or the expiration has expired, both of which are true in this case, but either could be true, and forced us to go to the login page. Let's implement the login page next. So now let's implement that login view. Back in Visual Studio, let's create a new file, again in our JS directory, and I'm just going to call that login.view. I'm using a single file component in this case to just go ahead and generate the view. So we're going to start with a template like we have before, and then we're going to have a script here. And the script is going to represent the actual object that has the data for the login. But let's just start by exporting just an empty object. We're not going to have any data associated with it yet. We're going to focus here on the template. Instead of wasting time having you watch me build the form by hand, I'm just going to copy it in. You'll be able to get this template from the After project if you're following along. But essentially, it's just a simple form. Here it says login, there's a wait cursor, there's an error section just like we've done before, and then there's a form very much like what we've done before, but that just has a username, and this should say password. And very important to make your input of type password. And then you can see we have some validation for simple required. Again, we've talked about that previously when building in validation to our Vue object, so I'm not going to belabor that too much. What we do need is you'll see that here in the V model, there's a credentials object. So let's down in our empty object here, let's go ahead and create a data element. And like we've done before, this data should be a function that returns an object that has all our data on it, and this will just have the credentials as an empty object for now. The other thing we're going to need is an onSubmit event, so let's go ahead and add that as well. So we're going to say methods onSubmit as a callback function, and then we're just going to be able to say alert this.credentials.username. Just so we can see that it's all working. We're not actually going to get this completely done. But now that we have our login page, very simple login page, we're going to go back to the router and we need to add a route just for that login page. We're going to do that by saying path, not surprisingly, is login, and then component is going to be our login, which we will need to get by importing it. We've already set this up to be able to read our own view, so let's see if we can actually get it to show the login page at this point. To refresh that login page, and there we can see our beautiful login page. It's pre-filled because of the browser has pre-filled those. But if we empty them, we can see validation is still working. Login button should call on submit. So if I put in some data and press login, it'll pop up that username for us. So we've got it working, and let's go back to the main page and show my info and show that it's going to actually take us to the login page. Once we log in, we should allow ourselves to be authenticated and be able to bypass this to actually go to the My Info page. The only other thing we want to make sure of is here in the login view, we're going to want the submit to actually check the validation. If you remember when we did the customer view, we had this call to this validator and then a callback function. We're going to actually use that same code. So I'm going to copy it from customer.js and put it into login. This essentially is telling the validator or the VE validation to force the validation to happen and then call back when it's done. I'm going to change this a little now that we're using ECMAScript 6 to use an arrow function instead, so that we're going to force the validator to be tested before we get down here to do our, in this case, alert. We're going to actually implement that pretty soon. Let's make sure this still works. To refresh it. And if we try to call login, it won't successfully do anything because our validation is failing. But as soon as we fill in both of these, it'll go ahead and show us that pop-up. So we know that the validation is actually being executed for us. So let's actually make this work by writing the code to get the token for us now that we're getting those actual credentials. Let's do that next. Now that we have the login, let's go ahead and retrieve the token. Back in Visual Studio, let's go back to the auth module of our Vuex store, and let's go ahead and create a new action called do authentication. Like the rest of the actions, this is going to take a context object, but we're also going to ask them to pass in their credentials because we're going to want to make that call to create the token on the server. Before we do that, though, we're going to want to return a new promise object so that the caller can wait for the network request to happen. Promise, of course, is going to take a callback, and this callback is going to include a resolve and a reject. We've done this a few times, but resolve is what we're going to call when it's successful, and reject is obviously when it fails. Now, to do the call to the server, we're going to need Axios again. So we're going to need to import it here, like we've done before. And then inside the promise, we'll just call axios.post. This is going to be to API account create token. And what we're going to pass to it is those credentials, the username and password that we're going to be getting from the login view. Once we do the post, we're going to call then, and I'll use a lambda in this case, or an arrow function as JavaScript likes to call it. And then I'll also add a catch with another arrow function. In the then here, we're going to want to get the response that Axios got from the server and do something with it. But if it's an error condition, we're just going to simply call reject. We're going to execute the reject from the promise to tell the caller that it's failed. If it succeeded, then we're going to actually want to change the JWT and the expiration in our state. But of course, we can't do that directly in the action. Again, the nature of Vuex is going to tell us we want all mutations to happen in, guess what? Mutations. So instead, we're going to call that context object that we're sent in from the authentication, and we're going to call commit to set token info. That's what we'll call this new mutation. And then we'll pass in the data that we're being sent from the create token. And then we can call resolve, because in this case, we'll have done everything we needed it to do. Now we can go ahead and create the mutation, set token info. We're going to be taking in that state object so we can make those changes to the state. And then we're going to get the token info, which is just this data that's being sent in from the server. Then it becomes as simple as just saying state JWT equals token info dot token and state dot expiration. We're going to want this to be a date. So we're simply going to say new date, but pass in the token info dot expiration, which it's sending us down a date string. So that should work. With all of this working, we should be able to go back to the login view and replace this with this.store dispatch, so we can call that action, do authentication. Should have made it shorter so I don't misspell it in front of you so many times. And just call this .credentials. So pass into the authentication the credentials that we just collected, and then we can do a then and a catch. And if you remember here in the template, we have a busy flag as well as a place to show errors. So we're going to want those as properties here as well. So is busy false, error, empty string. Then the catch just can become the symbol of error, this.error equals failed login. And then the success is simply going to do this.router. So we're going to point it at a new place, push, and here we'll just do the customer info. This is probably not what we really want to do here because we want to go to different sources, but for now this should be good enough. I'll show you soon how to handle true redirection. And of course we want to deal with the is busy, so here before the dispatch, we'll just say this is busy equals true and just add setting it to false to both of these cases as well, so that while we're doing the authentication we can actually show a busy flag. And so if we click on the My Info, we're taken to the login page, and when we press login, you can see we're getting into a weird state here. In fact, if we look at the console, it's not showing us any errors either, and that's very strange. The reason for this is kind of interesting, and it has to do with single file components. So we're calling the store here. In every other case, our components are actually constructed to include the store because it's propagated down the list. The reason this is not working is because store isn't going to be a member when you're using single file components. So we're just going to want to add the $ here for store. And if I've done everything correctly, when I log in, it should now take me to customer info. When I go back, if I go back into my info, we're retaining that token and expiration in there, so it should take me directly to the customer info now that we're logged in. Now that we have that, let's actually use our token to actually do things. And in our case, it's going to be implement this customer info page. Let's do that next. So now let's use the token when we call to the server. If we open up our customer info, we're going to want to deal with storing the actual customer data. Now, if you remember here, we're getting it from the store, so we should already be binding to it if it's successful. What we're going to want to do, though, is get that data when we're mounted. So we're going to add a mounted function here. And in order to do this, we're actually going to call an action. So we're going to say this.store.dispatch get customer info. And even though I'm not going to necessarily handle the error condition, I do need to call then to force the execution of the dispatch, even though I'm not going to be doing anything with the actual data related, because all this is going to do is fill in the data in the store and we're binding directly to it. So let's go ahead and just put a catch just in case. And so we have the really simple, just go get the customer info, fill it into the store. So we need to go back to the data store, because in the data store is where we actually have our customer module. So we can do all of this within that. We could break this out into its own file. And for the most part, I haven't created any structure in the way I'm using Vue here. In a more complex application where I'm not just trying to teach you, I would do this with a lot more structure and such. Just not the case in our particular example. So here in Actions, I'm going to create that get customer info as a call. And if you remember, we're already using Axios, so I can go ahead and include it here. And all that get customer info will do is first return a promise, which is the pattern here inside actions. Will be passed in resolve and reject, just like we've done a number of times already. And then inside the promise, we'll call Axios.get, and we'll ask for API customer, and we'll get the result, and go ahead and catch, and just say reject, again, just like we've done before. And then here we're going to want to call resolve, just to say, okay, we've gotten here, but we actually need to do something. We need to take this res.data, which is the data we're getting from the customer. We need to do something with it. And what we're going to do here, customer info is actually going to pass us in that context object. And we're going to use it here to say context.commit set customer info, and passing in that data that we're going to actually use. Again, just like we did setting the JWT earlier, we're going to do the same thing here in customer. So we're going to need a mutation, unsurprisingly called set customer info. It's going to pass us in the state and then the data we're being sent with which is the customer itself. State.customer equals the actual customer object, and we should be good to go. Done everything we need to do in order to call the customer and make it work. So let's see if we actually did everything right. If we refresh our customer info now, we'll actually get an error. And we're getting the error because, of course, I didn't structure the promise right. There should be a function that passes that down, and then that should simply be the end of the new promise. To get rid of the debugger for a moment, let's refresh this customer info. We'll look again, and even though we were on the page to go to the customer info, it took us to the login because by refreshing the whole page, we're resetting everything. So let's go ahead and log in. We're getting the customer info, but it's not showing. But if we come back to our customer info view, we'll see, of course, this needs to be this.error, not just error. Make that mistake constantly in Vue. Hopefully I'll get better at it as time goes on. So let's refresh it, do the whole thing again. And now we're seeing fail to get customer info. Why is this failing? If we look at the debugger, and let's look at the network for a minute, just refresh that. We'll see that calling the customer, getting that customer, is actually returning a 401 unauthorized. So we have that token, but we're not doing the right thing with it. So how do we actually fix that? The trick is in the data store itself, which luckily we have the token information in, we need to actually do one more thing before we do calling of the get. And what we do is pass as a second parameter, or a third if it happens to be a post or a put or one of those, is we're going to say that we are going to set our headers. And headers are just going to be an object. And here we're going to say authorization, which is the name of the header. It's actually capitalized, just to be sure. And we're going to say bearer with a space. Don't forget the space. Context. We could actually say getters, which is a little easier there. Now that we're setting the bearer token, let's go ahead and run this. And if we go to my info, we'll again have to log in. But now we're getting the name and phone number. And it happens to be that we never set the company name, but we're getting the customer info directly from our store. Next, let's make this a little more general purpose by handling the redirection correctly. So now let's deal with the redirection problem. Again, back in Visual Studio, we're going to go ahead and open up the router because we want to start the process here in the actual guard function. So if we're getting ready to send them to this path, what we'd like to do is be able to say store.commit set redirection. We're going to want to commit as in temporary storage where this redirection after the login goes, and we'll go ahead and get it back out when we actually do the login. We do this by passing into the commit to.path. So remember, this to is the route itself, and so path is one of those parameters that we're going to see, depending on which of these paths it is, that we're trying to go to. In our case, it's going to be this path, the customer info path. So let's implement this mutation real quick. We're going to do that back in the auth.js because it's part of that whole process. So we're going to add a redirect piece of data to our auth module, and then we just need a mutation for it. Set redirect. Add the state, add the path, and then state.redirect equals path, right? Nice and simple. And we're also going to want a getter for it. I've gotten into the habit of having a getter as the thing we actually retrieve data from instead of the actual state. And we'll just call that redirect, and then we'll just return state store.redirect. We're also going to want one more here, not just setting the redirect, but clear redirect, because we don't want to keep a stale redirection in there after we've used it once. So we'll just put redirect equals empty string, just so we can have a way of doing that. So we know how to set the redirect from the route guard here. How do we actually use it in the login then? Here in the login, instead of pushing this customer info, what we're going to actually do is two pieces. First, we're going to get the redirect by calling this .store.getters.redirect. So we're going to pull that out of the getters, and then we can just tell it to push to our redirect, which is fine. But once we pull it out, we're also going to say this.store.commit clear redirect, right? So we're going to clear the redirect so we don't have an old stale one sitting there, and then we can have the push there as well. We could have put the clear redirect inside of the getter as well, but for clarity, I just want you to see all the moving pieces. And if we've done all of this right, we should have that redirection working regardless of what page we go to. I'm not going to create a fake page to show you this, but with all of this working, we should have the redirection continue to work. So over in the browser, let's go to the home, and one of us did something wrong. And I forgot a comma someplace. This is telling me in the auth.js. So let's go look at that and see what I did wrong. Probably here. There's redirect. Oh, no semicolon after it. I get that wrong so many times as well. So let's try this again. Let's go to the store, go to my info, takes us to the login, should take us to the good customer info. And then if I go back to my info again, should just take me there. So now I've shown you how to set and get and protect routes, work with the tokens themselves. You should be able to deal with expiration. So as soon as that expiration has passed, it'll force you to log in again, get that information back. One of the changes I haven't talked about here is you may want to end up storing the JWT not just in your application, but maybe in browser storage as well. That's certainly an option, depending on how long-lived you want those tokens to be. The longer-lived JW tokens are, the more chance that someone will grab it and try to use it in your system. So there is some choice there, whether like a 10 or 20 minute expiration or a 2-week, if maybe you weren't dealing with something that isn't that sensitive. That's up to you. But let's go ahead and wrap up this module. So we've been talking about securing Vue with JSON Web Tokens, or JWTs as I like to call them. I've shown you that using JWT is an easy way to secure your API calls. I showed you how to mark views with your own metadata so that you can use information about a route in order to do things with guards. I showed you how to use a JWT when calling the server, and that's simply adding it as a bearer token. I showed you how to use a guard so you can check for auth poor routing, though using guards for different things like even logging pathways through your application is something that could be really useful. So thank you for not only going through Module 8 of this course, but completing the entire course. If you have any questions, remember, go to the comment section of whatever part of the course you're using, add your comments there. There's also a post-course review I'd love you to take. It's at the bottom of the entire course. It's a simple set of questions about how you liked the course, what you liked and didn't like about the course, and what we can change going forward. Thanks again for taking the course with Wildermind's training. My name is Sean Wildermuth. I've been your instructor.